Hello, ladies and gentlemen. This is Dan Trotter, Pretty Good Bible Studies. This video that you're about to see is the seventh in a series of videos concerning New Covenant theology. The New Covenant theology is an attempt to describe and to explain the connection between the Old Covenant and the New Covenant. This is a theological question that has bothered the church for 2 millennia. Two other current theological systems have tried to solve that problem. One is covenant theology, to be distinguished from New Covenant theology. This is Reformed people. And the other viewpoint is dispensationalism. I did 6 videos on covenant theology and 9 videos on dispensationalism in this playlist in order to give a background in which I showed what the position was and the weaknesses were. And now I'm in the process of showing how New Covenant theology splits the difference and solves the errors and the problems of those other two systems of theology. In this particular video, I'm going to be talking about the differences between the Old Covenant and the New Covenant, and we'll see that there's some overlap and there's some change. Covenant people like to say that there's no change at all except for a difference in administration. An administration of the covenant of grace under Moses, they say, an administration of the covenant of grace under the New Covenant. It's just a minor change. We're going to see that they're partially right. There is some continuity, but there's a lot of discontinuity too. I hope you enjoy this video. All right, let me show you my PowerPoints outline here. I've already gone over in previous videos what is the law of Christ. I said it's the words of Jesus, the actions of Jesus, the words of his apostles, and the actions of his apostles. And the law of Christ can be summarized in this statement of Jesus. A new commandment I give you, that you love one another even as I have loved you. And then we looked at Jesus was a better lawgiver than Moses. He did not merely explain the law of Moses and clean up the law of Moses and deliver it from Pharisaic perversions, but he actually took the law of Moses and abrogated it and replaced the law of Moses with a higher law, the law of Christ. Now, in this section of my PowerPoints and in this video, I'm going to talk about Old Covenant and New Covenant differences. What are those differences? And then in the next videos, we'll take up the last 2 topics of the PowerPoints. So let's start now with section number 3 of my PowerPoints. Old Covenant and New Covenant differences. What are they? Well, here's a list in tabular form of the differences. This table is from an article by John Zenz. John Zenz is one of the seminal theologians who started New Covenant theology. And I know John Zenz. I've had house church conferences at which he spoke. And I think that I'll just give a shout out here. His articles are excellent on New Covenant theology. They're free of charge in PDF form on the internet. John Zenz, Z-E-N-S. Now, this table shows the progression or the change from the Old Covenant to the New Covenant. The Old Covenant gives way to the New Covenant. Okay, so now we're looking at Old Covenant and New Covenant differences, how things change. First of all, we have Moses as the mediator in the Old Covenant. And by the way, this is all based on a very key passage in 2 Corinthians. Moses gives way to, as the mediator of the law, of the Old Covenant law, gives way to Jesus as the mediator of a new commandment to the church. The law of Moses gives way to the law of Christ. The ministry of death under Moses, because that's what the law did, it showed us that we were sinners and killed people. The ministry of death gives way to the ministry of life, because the law of Christ gives life to us. The ministry of letter gives way to the ministry of the Spirit. Moses being the letter and Jesus being the ministry of the Spirit. Then, by the way, that does not mean that there are no positive commands under the law of Christ. It just means that we now have the Holy Spirit in us operating to help us keep those commands. Moses more or less had sanctions and threats to keep people on the straight and narrow. The Old Covenant consisted of writing on stones. The New Covenant has writing on our hearts. The New Covenant was characterized by a fading glory. That gives way to an abiding glory in the New Covenant. And in the Old Covenant, we have a ministry of condemnation. That ministry of condemnation gives way to a ministry of righteousness. Continuing on with the same theme, still talking about 2 Corinthians 3. Well, actually, we move into different verses now. Disobedient people, as cited in Hebrews chapter 10, verse 9, that the Old Testament Jews were disobedient. All you have to do is read the Old Testament. You get that idea very quick. Well, that disobedience gives way to an obedient people, as we see in Hebrews 10:10. And then we, in the Old Covenant, we have people who as a whole do not know the Lord. It's mostly unregenerate people in the Old Covenant. That gives way to the New Covenant, where the people as a whole know the Lord. There might be a few people who claim that they're Christians in the church that don't know the Lord, but we have a regenerate church membership. None of this covenant idea of a visible church that consists of wheat and tares. In the Old Covenant, we have a theocracy where the church and state are united. That gives way into the New Covenant to a spiritual nation which cannot be identified with any political order. So we see huge differences between the Old Covenant and the New Covenant. We see large discontinuity. Now, let's look at some of the laws in the Old Covenant and New Covenant, and we'll see that even though there is a big difference in the two covenants, but the laws themselves, many of them remain unchanged, repeated, republished, if you will, in the New Covenant. And so that creates somewhat of a continuity between the Old Covenant and the New Covenant. Some of the laws in the Old Covenant, for example, the fourth commandment that says that we should remember the Sabbath, the Saturday Sabbath, to keep it holy, that law has been repealed. And then we actually have some laws added to in the Old Covenant, laws added to in the New Covenant that didn't exist in the Old Covenant. So let's take these up one by one. Let's first of all start with laws that are unchanged in the New Covenant. I'm going to go through the 10 commandments. We're going to find out that 9 of those commandments are repeated in the New Covenant. So all of these Reformed theologians and covenant theologians who are so upset about and so concerned about antinomianism, if you believe in New Covenant theology, you'll be an antinomian and you'll be able to have sex with a donkey. I mean, bestiality, you can't stop bestiality. Listen, 9 of the 10 commandments are repeated in the law of Christ in the New Testament. No problem. And I'm going to show you this. We'll start with the first commandment. You shall have no other gods before me. We do away with that because we're not under Moses anymore, but now we're under the New Covenant, and we read in Acts 14, verse 15. This is Paul saying, men, why are you doing these things? What they were doing was trying to offer oxen as a sacrifice to Paul and Barnabas. Barnabas, Zeus being the big guy, Paul being Hermes, being the talker. And they were about to have a pagan sacrifice and basically creating idols out of Paul and Barnabas. And Paul says, men, why are you doing this? You should turn from these vain things, these empty things, these nugatory things, these idols. You should turn from these idols to a living God who made the heaven and the earth and the sea and all that's in them. And then we have in 1 Corinthians 8:6, Paul tells the Corinthians, yet for us there is one God, the Father, from whom are all things and for whom we exist, and one Lord, Jesus Christ, through whom are all things and through whom we exist. One God, that means no other God. So basically the first commandment is repeated in the New Covenant. The first commandment in the Old Covenant, in the 10 commandments, is repeated in the New Covenant. Let's go to the second commandment. Moses says in the 10 commandments in the Old Covenant, you shall not make for yourself a carved image. In the New Covenant, we see the second commandment basically repeated. 1 John 5:21, John says this to his readers, little children, keep yourselves from idols, which is the same commandment, basically. 1 Corinthians 10:7, Paul tells the Corinthians, do not be idolaters. So there you have it, a repeat of the second commandment against idols is repeated in the New Testament. Let's go to the third commandment. Moses said in the Old Covenant, you shall not take the name of the Lord your God in vain. In the New Covenant, under the law of Christ, we have James 5:12 says this, but above all, my brothers, do not swear, either by heaven or by earth or by any other oath, but let your yes be yes and your no be no, so that you may not fall under condemnation. So if you said, by God, I'll pay you that money next week, that's taking God's name in vain. And James says, don't do that. Just let your yes be yes and your no be no. So you have a commandment in the new covenant which takes care of the same commandment in the old covenant. We don't need the third commandment anymore. We can repeal the old covenant and not fall into antinomianism. Now I'm going to skip the fourth commandment. That's the Sabbath commandment, because that one's been repealed. We're looking right now at old covenant laws that are unchanged and repeated in the new covenant. The fifth commandment says, honor your father and your mother in the old covenant on the tablets of stone. In the new covenant, in Ephesians 6:2, Paul says this, honor your father and mother. He quotes the fifth commandment and repromulgates that law in the new covenant. So if we're under the new covenant law of Christ, we're doing the same thing as the Jews were doing under Moses. So we can get rid of the fifth commandment and just rely on the law of Christ. No problem. Let's go to the sixth commandment. The sixth commandment says, you shall not murder. That was in the old covenant on the law, on the tablets of stone, the 10 commandments under Moses. The new covenant, 1 John 3:12 says this, we should not be like Cain, who was of the evil one and murdered his brother. So there we say we shouldn't be like a murderer. That's the same thing as saying you shall not murder. Romans 13:9 repeats the same idea. For the commandments, you shall not murder, and any other commandment are summed up in this word, you shall love your neighbor as yourself. And remember, Jesus said in John 13, a new commandment I give you, that you shall love one another even as I've loved you. So this loving your neighbor as yourself, that's a quote from the Old Covenant too, Deuteronomy somewhere. So, but at any rate, the apostles have every right to quote from the Old Testament, bring those laws over in the New Testament, and now we're under those new laws. So the effect is the same. We're still commanded not to murder, even though we've done away with the Old Covenant 6th commandment that says you shall not murder. Let's go to the 7th commandment, which says you shall not commit adultery. That's on tablets of stone in the Old Covenant at Mount Sinai. In the New Covenant, under the law of Christ, we have this. Paul tells the Ephesians in chapter 5, verse 3, but sexual immorality and all impurity must not even be named among you, as is proper among saints. And of course, sexual immorality includes adultery, as well as a bunch of other stuff that you're not supposed to do. It's not even proper among saints. So there's the command to not commit adultery is repeated in the New Covenant, so we can do away with the 7th commandment, and we're still under law, the law of Christ. We're not antinomian. Ephesians 5:5, which is 2 verses later, Paul says this to the Ephesians, for you may be sure of this, that everyone who is sexually immoral or impure has no inheritance in the kingdom of Christ and God. Serious business, this purity question is, and Paul couldn't have made it clearer. We don't need the 7th commandment. We don't need it because we've got it under the law of Christ in the New Covenant. Let's go to the 8th commandment, which says, you shall not steal. In the New Covenant, we have Ephesians 4:28. Let the thief no longer steal. Same basic command. We're under the New Covenant, we won't steal. We don't need the Old Covenant to tell us not to steal. Let's go to the 9th commandment. In the Old Testament, on tablets of stone, Moses wrote this at the hand of God. Or actually, God wrote this directly. You shall not bear false witness against your neighbor. No perjury, no lying. 9th commandment. Repeated in the New Covenant, Colossians 3:9. Do not lie to one another. Well, if you're not going to lie to one another, you're not going to bear false witness to your neighbor. So the New Covenant law of Christ takes care of what has been abrogated in the Old Covenant. Let's go. Oh, we got another one here. Ephesians 4, verse 25. Therefore, Paul tells the Ephesians, having put away falsehood, let each one of you speak the truth with his neighbor. So, you worried about Christians being able to lie because we've done away with the 10 commandments and abrogated them? Well, under the law of Christ, we've got the same restrictions. You don't lie, you tell the truth. The 10th commandment in the Old Covenant, you shall not covet anything that is your neighbor's. Look at that, this green-eyed envy. Don't covet anything that's your neighbor's. That's in the Old Covenant. But how about the New Covenant? Ephesians 5:3, but covetousness must not even be named among you as is proper among saints. So Paul repeats the strictures against coveting in the New Covenant. So we can do away with the 10th commandment in the Old Covenant, and we're still under law. Except it's not the law of Moses now, it's the law of Christ. You see this guy here coveting his neighbor's wife. She's a pretty hot wife, probably hotter than most neighbors' wives. He's got a problem here. But even his thinking about this should not even be named among you. Don't talk about it. Don't even think about it. All right, so those are the laws that are unchanged, going from the Old Covenant to the New Covenant. Now, some laws are repealed, and of course, that's what we'll look at now. And of course, we're going to talk about the fourth commandment, because this is the chink in the armor of Reformed theologians who say the law is flat, it doesn't change going from the Old Covenant to the New Covenant. It's the same law. Same moral law, they say. Remember the Sabbath day to keep it holy. Some of them will go so far as to say the Sabbath day as a moral law was written on the hearts of Adam. And some of them will even go so far as to say even somebody in Tibet is supposed to worship God on Saturday. Or, of course, they switch it to Sunday, which is illegitimate in my opinion, but that's how serious some of these Reformed people say about keeping the old Mosaic covenant in effect. And I say you can't do it. First of all, let's look at the scripture. Colossians 2, verses 16 through 17. Therefore, let no one pass judgment on you in questions of a Sabbath, which means if I want to worship, if I want to work and cut my grass on Saturday, if I want to go to my job on Saturday, nobody can pass judgment on me. That's straight out of the Bible. That's not interpretation. That's not a translation problem. There's no textual problem there. It's let no one pass judgment on you in questions of a Sabbath. Nobody can tell me, no reformer can tell me you are breaking the Sabbath. These things, including the Sabbath, I think he was referring also to things you eat and so forth. But these things, including the Sabbath, are a shadow of the things to come. But the substance belongs to Christ. Sabbath rest is Jesus. The Sabbath resting on Saturday was a type of us resting in Jesus. The type has been done away with. It has been fulfilled. The fourth commandment is bye-bye. Hebrews 4:9 then says, so then there remains a Sabbath rest for the people of God. There you have the type. The Sabbath has been fulfilled just like I said. And the Sabbath now refers to Jesus, who fulfilled the fourth commandment, thus abrogating it, and thus fulfilling it, and thus terminating it. All right, now, we've got some laws being unchanged, going from the Old Covenant to the New Covenant. We've got some laws that were repealed. I gave you one, the Sabbath law. Now we have some laws that are actually added to the Old Covenant. And that's what we'll look at now. Old Covenant laws that are added to in the New Covenant. Romans 7:15 says this. Paul tells the Romans, but if the unbelieving partner separates, let it be so. In such cases, the brother or sister is not enslaved. Now, we've got to do some background here. First of all, Moses allowed divorce for less than adultery. I mean, we know you could give a certificate of divorce for some kind of indecency, and the indecency could not have been adultery because the penalty for that was death. So whatever that indecency was, it was less than adultery. It was probably things like burning the toast, not brushing your teeth enough, burping in public, that kind of thing. Stupid reasons. But Jesus did not allow divorce for stupid reasons. He allowed divorce only for adultery. This is in Matthew 19. So Jesus was taking the law as it was at creation, and he brought it on up in the New Testament times. Because when we were first created, divorce was the only reason, sexual immorality was the only reason for divorce, not frivolous type reasons. Now, what Paul does, we're talking about now, Old Covenant laws are added to in the New Covenant. Paul, in the New Covenant, adds a reason for divorce, desertion of the unbelieving spouse. Now, Paul was dealing with a new situation since Jesus' time. The church was there. You got believers and non-believers who had married non-believers. That was a situation that really had not happened before. And so Paul, as an apostle of Christ, added to the law of marriage. Jesus said divorce only is the only reasons for divorce. Paul says, okay, divorce, but I'm going to add one. Desertion of an unbelieving spouse. Now, he had the right to change Jesus' law because he was an apostle of Jesus. So here's the summary principle. God's moral character never changes. We would agree with the reformers on that. But God legislates differently given the condition of those who are under his law. Now, actually, covenant people do say differently, because here's what they say. They say, well, God administers a covenant of grace which covers the old covenant and the new covenant, an overarching covenant of grace. But the covenant of Moses, the old covenant, is under a different administration, whatever that means. And then the new covenant under Jesus is under a different administration than the covenant under Moses. It's the same covenant, though, a so-called made-up, theologically constructed covenant of grace, which is not in the Bible. And they do that. They're trying to emphasize the continuity of God's nature and character as we go from the old covenant to the new covenant. Well, new covenant people say, look, it is true God legislates differently, but it's more than just a change of administration. It's a change of law. It's a whole different law. Now, the same moral law informs the old covenant law and the new covenant law. It's the same moral law, but the actual code, the actual law that we're living under, is different now as for us as Christians. We're under the law of Christ. The Old Testament Jews were under the law of Moses. Now, to show how the law of marriage, which is an expression of God's moral law, but to show you how it's changed over time, there was a very strict requirement for marriage at creation with Adam and Eve. One person only, and no divorce. But then as time went on, people got more and more sinful and harder. So Moses, when he legislated under the old covenant, he allowed divorce for frivolous reasons or less than adulterous reasons, we'll put it that way. And then we get to Jesus' time in Matthew 19. Jesus says, Moses was loose, but I'm telling you, only for adultery can you get divorced. So he tightens the law back up, makes it more strict. And then Paul comes along and makes it less strict when he adds another possible cause for divorce, which was desertion of an unbelieving spouse. So you see the law has changed as we go from epoch to epoch. But at any rate, we can see here the problem of continuity and discontinuity. Reformers emphasize continuity. That's just a mere change of administration as we go from Moses to Jesus. New Covenant people say, no, Moses' law is fundamentally different than Jesus' law because it's ministering to different people in different circumstances. The Old Covenant was a body of people who were a nation, not a church. They were mainly unregenerate, not mostly regenerate. They had a military, they had a court system, so we have to use the law of Moses with them. When we get to the New Testament, we're talking about people who are born again of the Holy Spirit, who are Christian brothers and sisters. They're in the church. Therefore, the law is going to be administered differently. Okay, ladies and gentlemen, I have finished with this video concerning Old Covenant and New Covenant differences. I hope you enjoyed this video, and I hope you might like to subscribe to my channel if you so desire. And stay tuned for the next video because